to the November 6, 2023 meeting of the City of Pacifica Planning Commission. This meeting is called to order. May I please have a roll call?
Commissioner Berman.
Present.
Commissioner Devine.
Present.
Commissioner Godwin.
Present.
Chair Hauser.
Present.
Commissioner Wright.
Present.
Commissioner Godwin, can you lead us in the salute to the flag?
Sure.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Sure.
Before we get into administrative business, any member of the public wishing to make public comment on the agenda should complete a speaker card and bring it to the front and hand it to staff. On the card, please indicate the agenda item number on which you wish to comment or oral communications for items not on the agenda. Members of the public may also participate in the meeting via Zoom. There's a dial-in option for making public comment. The phone number is 669-900-6833. Once dialed in, enter conference number 811-5615-8241 and then press the pound key. Once the chair has announced the public comment opportunity for the item on which you wish to comment, press star 9 to raise your hand if dialing by phone or the raised hand function in Zoom. City staff will then identify you by your name or the last 4 digits of your phone number when it is your turn to speak. If dialing in, once identified for your turn, press star 6 to unmute yourself, wait a few seconds, and then begin speaking. Be sure to mute any other broadcast you may be watching, such as Channel 26 or the live stream. Also, dial-in instructions are shown on the screen. Can we show them on the screen? And I will call each speaker, whether in person or by dial-in, for their public comment opportunity. Public meetings are a limited public forum, meaning that there are rules for commenting at these meetings. Comments on non-agendized items must address matters within the subject jurisdiction of the Planning Commission, and comments on agendized items must relate to that specific item. If comments do not fall into one of these categories, the city will provide you with an initial warning to stay within the subject matter jurisdiction of the city or on topic. If the warning is not followed, the chair will direct the city clerk to cut off the microphone, and throughout this warning system, I will seek the assistance of the deputy city attorney in identifying comments not related to the agenda item or not within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Planning Commission. Okay. With that, I'd like to get an approval of the order of agenda. Do we have a motion?
I move that we approve the order of agenda.
I'd be glad to second. Thank you.
Please vote.
And that motion passes unanimously.
Fantastic. We don't have any minutes tonight, and I don't see any designations for liaison to City Council. Is that still correct, Director Murdoch?
Chair, good evening, Planning Director Christian Murdoch. I do want to indicate that subsequent to publication of this agenda packet, became clearer that we may need to cancel the next Planning Commission meeting, and so we wouldn't then have the opportunity to appoint a liaison in the event the Planning Commission makes a recommendation to City Council tonight. So it may be worthwhile to appoint a liaison for the November 27th City Council meeting, where the emergency shelter ordinance would be heard in that eventuality.
Okay. Would anyone like to volunteer for November 27th? Can also play eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Well, then, I guess in the absence of any other volunteers, I will do it.
We really appreciate that, Commissioner Wright. So, Director Murdoch, you have what you need.
Thank you, Chair. And we'll revisit that in the event that we do have the next Planning Commission meeting.
Understood. Thank you. Oral communications. So this portion of the agenda is available to the public to address the Planning Commission on any issue within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Commission that is not on the agenda. The time allowed for any speaker will be 3 minutes. Deputy City Attorney, do you feel like we need to read the warning system advisory again?
No, I think it's fine. The advisory that you had issued previously will be in effect for these comments.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. As seeing I do not have any speaker cards, I will check just here. Does anyone have any item for oral communications? Okay, seeing none, do we have any callers via Zoom or
We have
phone?
no callers at this time.
Then I will close the public comment period for oral communications.
Just to be clear, I think I see a yellow card there, perhaps for later.
Thank you, Commissioner Wright. We have no consent items, and we do have a new public hearing. So, you know what? I just realized that I forgot to take public comment on the administrative business. Do we need to do that now?
We can just confirm that there is no public comment.
Okay. Any raised hands?
There are no callers at this time.
Anyone in the room? Okay, I will take that as none, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, so file number 2023-013, text amendment TA-124-23, initiated by the City of Pacifica to add a new Article 53, Emergency Shelters, to the City of Pacifica zoning regulations, Chapter 4 of Title 9 of the Pacifica Municipal Code, to create zoning provisions for approval, construction, and operation of an emergency shelter consistent with the requirements of state law, to amend Article 11C-2 Community Commercial District to make an emergency shelter with 20 or fewer occupants a permitted use and an emergency shelter with 21 to 30 occupants a conditional use, to update sections of the City of Pacifica's zoning regulations to include updated definitions for community care facility and family daycare home, to be consistent with the requirements and definitions of state law, and make other minor conforming revisions. May we have a staff report?
Good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. My name is Brianne Harkusha, Senior Planner with the Planning Department, who will be giving the presentation tonight. As the Chair mentioned, the project before you this evening is a text amendment initiated by the City of Pacifica for an emergency shelter ordinance and various other amendments to be consistent with the requirements and definitions of state law. The proposed amendment would enact a new Article 53 into Chapter 4 zoning of Title 9 Planning and Zoning of the Pacifica Municipal Code concerning emergency shelters to comply with the requirements of state law. Other amendments, as listed on this slide, would modify the definitions and permitted and conditional uses sections of the zoning regulations to update the definition and terms for community care facilities and family daycare homes. Additionally, the permitted and conditional uses sections of the residential zoning regulations are proposed to be updated to update the maximum number of children permitted to be cared for in a family daycare home. The city is proposing the text amendment to identify a zoning district that allows emergency shelters as a permitted use without a conditional use or other discretionary permit, and that are suitable for residential uses to be consistent with Senate Bill 2. Additionally, staff has prepared this text amendment to implement the required zoning to permit emergency shelters to address HCD's comment on the city's sixth cycle housing element and to be consistent with state law. Completion of this effort is a prerequisite to obtain housing element certification by HCD. Additionally, Assembly Bill 2339, adopted in 2022, amended Government Code Section 65583A4 and requires a more robust and thorough analysis of sites when zoning for emergency shelters. Details of this analysis will be discussed later in this presentation. As discussed, the other text amendments are to perform cleanup of the Pacifica Municipal Code. The amendments would update the definition and term from child daycare home to family daycare home, and to update the maximum number of children to be cared for from 12 to 14 in all residentially zoned properties to be consistent with state law. Additionally, the term and definition for special care facilities is updated to community care facilities to be consistent with state law. For the emergency shelters, the proposed regulations were prepared based on the requirements of state law, and adoption of Article 53 for emergency shelters is essential for the city to achieve HCD certification. The proposed new Article 53 would have 6 new sections. The definition section is proposed to be consistent with the standards definition per state law. Some other key elements of the sections are that the C2 zoning district would permit emergency shelters by right. Emergency shelter development must be consistent with development regulations of the C2 zoning district, off-street parking and loading, and any uniform building and housing code standards. Standards for emergency shelter operations, which include a limited term of stay, size of waiting and client intake, number of beds is permitted to be 20 by right, and between 21 and up to a maximum of 30 would require a use permit, and emergency shelters proposals will be reviewed and approved by the planning director. Additionally, staff inadvertently changed the term of stay to days instead of months, which is inconsistent with the state's definitions. So therefore, staff recommends an amendment to the limited terms of stay in Section 3 of Exhibit A of Attachment A to modify the 180-day term of stay to 6 months term of stay to be consistent with the state's definition. Now I'll be going through the site suitability criteria as it pertains to Assembly Bill 2339. AB, or Assembly Bill 2339, identifies specific criteria that local governments are required to analyze to demonstrate sites with sufficient capacity when identifying zoning designations to accommodate emergency shelters. And the key criteria of the amendment include: 1, designating at least one zoning district that allows emergency shelters by right; 2, a site analysis to document that there is enough land to accommodate the need for emergency shelters; 3, site analysis to ensure designating zoning districts include adequate sites that meet state requirements; and 4, a site analysis for capacity of at least one year-round shelter. As included in the staff report, there's a site-by-site data analysis in Attachment C, and maps prepared to visually reflect each site are included as Attachment D to the staff report. As discussed in the staff report, staff has identified the C2 zoning district as the designation to permit emergency shelters by right to satisfy the requirements of state law. C2 zoning district is the most suitable zone to accommodate emergency shelters, as the district is located within proximity of transit, amenities, and services that could contribute to individuals utilizing an emergency shelter. The permitted and conditional uses and development regulations of the C2 district also apply to professional office and commercial recreational districts. Therefore, emergency shelters would also be permitted in these zoning districts. However, staff identified that sites in the commercial recreation district would not be viable based on the analysis, and sites in the O district were not evaluated, as after evaluating the C2 zoning districts, we have indicated sufficient capacity and suitability to accommodate emergency shelters. As also shown on this slide, the state requires the city to demonstrate enough land to accommodate the need for emergency shelters, and that calculation is provided by multiplying 161 people experiencing homelessness by 200 square feet. That would result in a 0.74 acres of land that would be needed for the city of Pacifica. And as shown in the table, C2 zoning district has about 45 acres of non-vacant sites and 1.85 acres of vacant sites. And staff has confirmed that the sites would be consistent with the capacity requirements. There are approximately 45 acres on 15 parcels ranging from 0.11 acres to 30.2 acres that are developed sites. Staff identified property along Oceana Boulevard with vacant tenant space, and also multiple developed properties that contain office and commercial uses that have what we call an ILV, or improvement to land value ratio, of less than 0.5. So at the ILV, or improvement to land value ratio, was used to identify redevelopment potential, as the ILV with a lower ratio would indicate a greater potential for redevelopment. The value, this is because the value of existing improvements is, if it's less than the value of the underlying land, then the potential is greater for redevelopment. Based on this analysis performed, non-vacant sites identified in the C2 zoning district were also found to be suitable sites. As shown on this slide, there are 3 vacant sites with non-residential zoning that allow residential development. It's slightly difficult to see, but in red circled, there are Site 10, Site 13, and Site 15. Site 10, which is more north, is roughly 1.56 acres and can provide capacity for up to 20 beds or persons. Using the assumption of 200 square feet per person, the city has at least 32,000 square feet available for an emergency shelter at this site and at this single vacant parcel. So therefore, the city has identified capacity in this zone to accommodate an emergency shelter, either on vacant or non-vacant sites. Staff finds that the proposed amendments to the ordinance are consistent with state law and exempt from CEQA. Staff is also seeking authority from the Planning Commission to make changes requested by HCD in the event HCD requests modifications to the ordinance from now until the City Council meeting. Staff recommends amending the end of Section 5 of the resolution, including as Attachment A to the staff report, to state, and as shown in the bolded text, with any changes that may be required by California Department of Housing and Community Development, just to allow staff to modify before the City Council meeting. As mentioned in the presentation earlier, staff also recommends amending the limited term of stay from 180 days to 6 months to be consistent with state law's definition. Therefore, staff recommends the Planning Commission adopt the resolution as amended to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance to the City Council and incorporate all maps and testimony into the record by reference. This concludes staff's presentation, and staff is available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Rakusha. Does the commission have questions for staff? Okay. So since we are going to reserve until post-public comment, I'd like to open the public hearing and remind folks in the audience to please fill out a yellow speaker card if you wish to speak, and then Deputy City Attorney, if you wouldn't mind reminding us of the warning.
Of course. Public meetings are a limited public forum, meaning that there are rules for commenting at these meetings. Comments on agendized items must relate to that specific item. If comments do not fall into this category, the city will provide you with an initial warning to stay on topic. If the warning is not followed, the chair will direct the city clerk to cut off the microphone, and throughout this warning system, the chair will seek my assistance in identifying comments not related to the agenda item.
Thank you. I do not have speaker cards, but I see folks with speaker cards, so please bring them up and hand them to staff, and then I will call you in the order in which you. Thank you. Chris Redfield.
Good evening, staff and commissioners. Well, this is simply a zoning change to kind of coincide with the demands of HCD in the housing element. And I know this is some housekeeping and some current outdated definitions for emergency daycare and whatnot. San Mateo County recently had a presser, and they have $7.4 million that they just allocated from an $84 million state grant to update fairground facilities around the state. And that's $7.4 million, which was done by Mike Callaghy and some other dignitaries, to put that money in for 600 people in an emergency shelter at San Mateo County Fairgrounds. That money came from the state. While we're mandated to do this, so it equates out to about $12,000 per person based on that for a 600-person count in the interim. And then the Samaritan House is the management agency that's going to be in charge of operating that facility ongoing. And as I said, 180 days were mentioned, 6 months, things like that for homeless. I'm curious, what if we are available when it comes to push to shove and we're required to build that? That equates out here to about $240,000 for a 20-person facility in Pacifica. That doesn't count management. That is simply just basically to build it. So that's an ongoing process. And I'm curious if down the road there is grant funding available to the city, because we all know we ain't got it. So we're going to need outside funding. This was part of this for San Mateo County was matching funding. The fairground facility put in, I believe, $1 million on that. So it's big money. That's obviously a bigger number. But we all know those, the sites are being addressed now to find those sites, work those into the housing element. But funding is always that key thing. So that's where I'm curious if that is available down the road in this planning amount. Even though we're mandated to do it, if we don't have funding, we can't do it. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. And that is the only speaker card that I have. So with that, I'm going to move to public comment via Zoom and phone. Do we have any raised hands?
We have one raised hand at this time. Dan Stagink, you may unmute yourself and state your full name at the start of your comment.
Mr. Stagink, please go ahead.
That's correct. Sorry, I just got that mute right now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Excellent. I wanted to draw the Commissioner's attention to page 6 of tonight's agenda, which details emergency shelters shall include other interim interventions, including but not limited to navigation centers, bridge housing, and respite or recuperative care. The first two of those, navigation centers and bridge housing, most frequently have the word homeless appended to them, as in homeless navigation centers and homeless bridge housing. I've noticed that a large number of the sites listed here are in or adjacent to Pedro Point. I'm not certain why that is and why that might be a good location for homeless services. It's certainly at the southern end of town there. One of them, the Anchor Inn, is an active hotel that's creating TOT for this almost bankrupt city, TOT, transient occupancy tax, for those who don't know, and was a huge reason this Anchor Inn project was originally approved. As a planning commissioner myself, when it was approved, I'm shocked now that it would be listed as a potential site for emergency shelters. If you look at what the county did in Millbrae, and Mike Callady, essentially the county manager, they essentially forced a solution in where they took over a TOT producing hotel, producing $600,000 a year of TOT, and they made it into a homeless shelter. And they're reimbursing the city $600,000 for 1 year, but the combined 20-year effect of that is only almost $26 million. I'm not certain why a large number of these projects are in City Council Member Beckmeyer's district, but everyone I talked to in Pedro Point had never heard of this project. The fact that it was located in, that it was noticed in the San Mateo County Daily Journal is questionable also, as the Daily Journal, until recently, until the last 9 months, was not even available in Pacifica, and I believe they have less than 40 subscribers in Pacifica. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stagink. Do we have any other raised hands?
We have one other raised hand. Caller 1606, you may unmute yourself and state your name.
Please press *6 to unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Sue DeGree. So I'm ignorant of some things that are going on, but I noticed that it's an emergency shelter and it mentioned an age limit, like 15. So I would have hoped that the county law would cover special needs individuals. And even if it's an emergency shelter, during fire, or if that's the kind of thing it is. Even a family unit, somebody whose child is 15 or 16, it seems, if I heard that correctly, they would not be able to be with the family. I'm concerned about special needs because somebody 15 and 16 has the special needs, they're not going to be able to go somewhere on their own. And even if they don't have a disability, I find it concerning at that age. That's all.
Thank you, Ms. Degree. Do we have any other raised hands?
We have no other callers.
With that, I will close public comment and bring it back to the commission. Does the commission have questions or I know the commission has questions for staff. Maybe what I'll do before we go to staff questions is just maybe re-ask some of the items that we heard from the community. We heard a couple of comments about financial implications, one about potential grant funding and the other about potential loss of TOT to the city, which, is something that is really critically important. So can staff maybe discuss a little bit about what analysis has been done and what your thoughts are?
Thank you, Chair Hauser. Brianne Herkusha, Senior Planner. The proposal tonight is for designating a particular zoning district to allow the emergency shelters. As of now, there are no proposals for specific development of emergency shelters, and those would be proposed at a later time by either state facility or I believe a private facility can also propose emergency shelter development as well. As for funding, that would probably be dependent on the type of shelter or when that does occur and is proposed.
Right. Good evening, Commissioners. Planning Director Christian Murdoch. As Senior Planner Harkushan mentioned, there is no plan for a specific shelter to be constructed at this time. I'm also not aware of any legal mandate for local government agencies to undertake the construction or operation of these facilities. We're simply setting the stage to comply with state law to set the land use conditions so that where the funding and a willing property owner and an operator have been identified, such a shelter can be constructed and operated. To the question of transient occupancy tax or TOT loss, indeed that is something that could occur if one of our motel operators decided to discontinue their business operation and sell their property or convert the operation to an emergency shelter. I think the scenario that was described is unique in the sense that if the county did come in and acquire a piece of property, they wouldn't be subject to the City of Pacifica's land use regulations. So I don't think it's something that we can necessarily safeguard against or need to worry about in this context. And so I think really thinking through what's the most appropriate zoning district in order to fulfill our obligation under state law is the question that's before the commission tonight.
Okay. And then I have some other questions on my list that kind of touch on that, but I'll reserve them for the end. I believe there was also a question about special needs groups, and that's something that throughout the housing element process, the Commission and Council have wanted to make sure that we're being inclusive of. Is there a way to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how we do this?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Hauser. I believe to answer the question about age limits, or I think that was the question. We're not aware of any age limits for emergency shelters specifically, but as for community care facilities, there are specific types of facilities that are considered community care. So there's might be some type of age definition associated with that. There's certain special needs, such as like foster care or people experiencing domestic violence or other types of, a variety of types of housing for community care. But we're not aware, as for emergency shelters, if there is an age limit for that.
And I also wanted to add that the ordinance does incorporate all of the state definitions for all of these uses. So emergency shelters, community care, family daycares are all consistent with the state law requirements.
That's very helpful, and maybe, if this does move forward to council tonight, maybe that, that data could potentially be available to council members so that they could make some sort of educated decision if this comes up again, because I think it's a good question. And with that, I'll go to the commissioners. Does anyone have questions? Commissioner Godwin.
Yeah, I've got a few. Did you consider groups like the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Red Cross, or other nonprofits as sponsors once we establish this to come in and set up a shelter?
Thank you, Commissioner Godwin.
Sure.
We haven't considered any assistance from nonprofits or FEMA, Red Cross. The proposal tonight is for the designation of the zoning district, so we haven't reviewed any site-by-site specific development of emergency shelters, but that may be in consideration if some nonprofit or FEMA, Red Cross proposes emergency shelters on a specific site.
Well, maybe I need to phrase this a little differently. Once this change was made in the ordinances, would groups like that be able to come in and set up an emergency shelter with minimal additional oversight on one or more of the shelter parcels?
So with respect to this ordinance, certainly any nonprofits or other groups could come in and construct an emergency shelter, which would be a permanent facility. There are also provisions in state and federal law regarding emergency housing. So for example, if there would be an earthquake or a flood and housing would be required, and FEMA might come in and they would be subject to federal regulations, but the intent of this ordinance is not to address emergency housing, but the emergency shelter construction. So typically, that wouldn't be FEMA, but it would be an operator that has experience operating emergency shelters.
So are you saying that, when the UN solves this problem or when the military goes someplace, they bring in a set of yurt-type tents and inductive transmitter for power and some water trucks and that kind of stuff for water and some portable toilets and showers? That type of operation would not be enabled by this, or would that be included? Or could some organization like that say, hey, we're here with our containers of tents and inductive chargers and showers and water trucks, and we're setting up in the next 4 hours and we've got a tent city? Is that something that would be allowed under this, or would that be prohibited, or would that be discussed later?
Yeah, that would not be the intent of this ordinance, to provide for that type of, immediately needed, perhaps emergency housing. The housing that would be constructed under these ordinances would still need to comply with the city's building code requirements that are in effect.
Okay. And my last question is, did you consider underutilized school sites and closed schools and church facilities that could be viable temporary housing shelters or somewhat more permanent thing, and partnering with either a nonprofit or a school district to provide some or all of these kind of services?
Thank you, Commissioner Godwin. Brianna Harkusha, Senior Planner. So staff did consider all zoning districts when citing for emergency shelters. When reviewing the zoning districts that applied for current and former public schools, they were not uniform or consistent throughout. So some schools had zoning districts that were single family or R1, some were planned development, some were even agricultural. So there wasn't a uniform zoning approach from a zoning standpoint. In addition, these properties were also spread across the city with some deep inside primarily residential areas, which were farther away from the sorts of services that are important to consider when siting for emergency shelters, such as different amenities and services that could provide to the individuals utilizing that shelter.
Okay. That's the end of my questions.
Commissioner Devine, followed by Commissioner Berman.
Yeah, I'd like to understand a little bit better the sites that are on these maps, and if this is just a blanket designation, all C2 zoning sites. And again, I'm reaching an intersection of trying to understand why so many of these sites, privately owned, functioning businesses, and what the intention is there. And some of these sites are on the housing element map as well. So how is this practical?
Thank you, Commissioner Devine. To start, to answer the question about the housing element sites, there are particular sites listed in the attachment C. There are about 12 of them that are housing element sites, but as we know, they will be part of the rezoning program, so they will eventually not be zoned in the community commercial zoning district. So those were excluded from the actual analysis when considering the sites. But if we refer back to the map, sorry, let me pull up an example. So for example, map 1, there are specific sites that are listed. It might be difficult to see, but site 1, site 2 is shown on this map and highlight or called out in red. So those are the ones that we're reviewing in particular as site suitability.
The bright red as versus the burgundy?
So that is also a discrepancy, a kind of a program issue we had with the colors. So all of the red, it's supposed to be the same type of red, but they all are C2 zoning districts. We just had an issue with the coloring of some of the sites, but the sites that you see in burgundy and the sites that you see in red are all C2 zoning district sites, and they are all sites that are being considered for the emergency shelter designation.
In sites 8, 9, and 10, which are also on the housing element list? If I understand correctly.
Yes. I'm pulling up the... Yes, I believe those sites were listed, after doing the sites inventory, those were listed as, I believe, backup sites for the housing element. I don't believe they were considered the core sites. So we excluded just the core sites from the list.
Okay, that's a little confusing, I guess, in like I said, in terms of trying to think about this practically. And then again, we're looking at sites 11 and 12, which is a fully functioning shopping center here. It's difficult to envision that changing into anything like this. What's the intention there? I mean, I'm really trying to be logical about this, and that's where my question, that's the direction of my questions.
So again, we have a duty to find a zoning district in town where we will allow emergency shelters as a permitted use. The sites need to allow residential use so that they're not put, for example, in industrial areas that are not suitable for people to reside. They need to be close to services, transit, et cetera. Many of the C2 zoned properties in Pacifica meet those criteria, and they also tend not to be so small where it would be intimately situated in most cases with surrounding residences and so forth. And so on balance, we felt like the C2 district in our assessment checked most of the boxes with the fewest drawbacks. Again, setting the conditions where if a property owner and an operator wanted to partner together to open an emergency shelter, the conditions exist to allow that to happen, not compelling any property owner to convert their property to an emergency shelter. So where there's a thriving business, there will continue to be a thriving business. Where there's perhaps a vacant lot where someone wants to sell it to an emergency shelter operator, that condition would exist to enable that to happen. So it's not forcing anyone to convert their property to an emergency shelter use.
But it would drastically affect the businesses in these areas if one lot or one parcel surrounded by a shopping center were to convert.
Possibly, but we have an obligation under state law to cite these and to treat them like any other residential use. So to the extent you're concerned about those impacts, where else would we put them in a zoning district that also allows residential use? We could put them in C1, which tend to be even more intimately situated. We could put them in multiple family residential, single family residential zoning districts, all of which have different sets of potential consequences and different relationships to the critical services and transit and so forth. So not suggesting it's an easy planning choice for the Planning Commission, but having to pick someplace, C2 seemed to be the best zoning district that was available for this purpose.
Thank you.
I have one, so I was going to let you go, but I do just want to ask one thing that was very relevant to what Commissioner Devine was saying. So as far as the housing element sites being on this list, my understanding is whether they're core sites or supplemental sites, they're all getting rezoned with our housing element effort. So even if they're appropriate for housing, for emergency shelters now, when we rezone them, we'll probably rezone them to a housing designation or mixed use designation. And I assume that that will take the amount of land out. And I think my question is that a correct understanding? And does that leave us with enough land in this designation to meet the requirements?
Right, so playing this out through adoption and completion of the phase 1 rezoning, we may need to revisit this emergency shelter zoning district or validate our analysis again to see if sufficient C2 zoning districts remain. So we don't know. This is a point in time today where we need to undertake this emergency shelter ordinance adoption. And if and when we would fall out of compliance because of subsequent zoning actions, we would need to bring ourselves back into compliance. And so that is an unknown at this point in time.
I guess my question's related to the topic discussed right now.
Do you want to give staff a second? I'll
Yeah,
make sure
sure.
to answer your question.
Yeah. So I have a few questions. I was going to start with a few overarching ones, but I'm going to get into the ones that more closely relate to Commissioner Devine and Chair Hauser's questions and concerns. Is HCD requiring that we specifically identify sites? Or can we just update the zoning language?
We don't need to identify specific sites where an emergency shelter will be constructed per se, but we do need to perform an analysis that demonstrates the sites that are so zoned are adequate across a number of criteria, which Senior Planner Harkusha can elaborate upon. So it's not quite we have to pick specific sites, but we do need to get to the site level to perform the analysis that's required to show the viability to accomplish the intent of state law, if that makes sense.
Okay, so from the HCD perspective, if we say that, if we amend the C2 zoning language to allow for emergency shelters, then the HCD reviewers could just look at all the C2 zoning in the city and kind of back calculate to confirm that, Granted, this will show, I guess, less commitment to like specifically choosing sites, but if we don't have to specifically choose sites, is it sufficient enough to just update the zoning language and give that to HCD?
I'd say that's largely what this ordinance proposes. It's to update the C2 zoning district to allow emergency shelters, to create a new article in the zoning standards that has particular criteria and standards for emergency shelters themselves. When it comes to the question of what is HCD looking at, Senior Planner Harkusha has performed a very detailed analysis that's actually quite conservative. It does not include all of the potential parcels that this zoning amendment would apply to. She analyzed a subset of those that are most likely and have the best chance to operate as an emergency shelter to demonstrate that we have complied with the minimum quantitative criteria in terms of land area, viability, suitability, habitability. But there are more sites indeed that would actually qualify if the conditions were right.
Okay, because it's a little scary, especially because we're all in the mindset of the housing element with our last couple of meetings with City Council. It's a little scary to see specific sites identified right now, and of course, we are naturally viewing them as, well, what if this site were actually developed with an emergency shelter, which is worthwhile considering because it's possible for anything under the C2 zoning to be constructed as an emergency shelter. But I just want to confirm, so we're not specifically prescribing these sites.
That's right. I guess that's a point that I hadn't anticipated. So these are not sites in the same sense that a housing element site is a site. Those sites were identified to align with the analysis that was performed to just globally demonstrate compliance with the site criteria, but they are not per se sites for emergency shelters at the exclusion of other land uses, for example.
Okay, thank you. Are we, and I don't know if this would be strategically preferred, but are we able to amend language to multiple zoning districts?
It's possible. Conceivably, that would expand the range of sites to even more potential emergency shelter sites. We've demonstrated we've met or exceeded all of the state's criteria, so there's no sort of minimum policy or legal reason to do that at this time, but it's something we can try to provide our best analysis and advice of if the commission's interested in doing that.
Okay. I'm not at this time, especially because now I see things clear after your previous clarification, but that was just one of my questions. Okay, sorry. Your answer to my first question kind of changes my other questions. So I know that there's some sites identified in the coastal zone, but I'm going to try to remove my focus from the sites and just look at C2 zoning. Will the Coastal Commission need to approve our zoning amendment in the coastal zone prior to HCD accepting our zoning amendment?
I don't have a specific answer to provide you on that point. I can speak generally in our cooperation with HCD in the course of working on our housing element. A number of land use matters, including general plan updates, rezonings, et cetera, all need to run through the Coastal Commission for certification before they'll take effect. HCD is aware of that, and I would say as a general matter, their position is as long as the city has done everything within its power, we're not going to come after you punitively. If we fail to diligently process our local coastal program amendment with the Coastal Commission, for example, as sort of a, it's not really going to take effect, that's a different situation, and I'm not suggesting the city's going to do that. But as long as we're doing everything in the city's power to advance that towards the ultimate certification, I feel confident, in my opinion, at least my impression of the HCD staff that we're working with, that we'll be on the right side of the law rather than the wrong side of the law.
Okay, good. That's kind of what I was getting at. I'd hate for this to kind of put us in purgatory for the housing element, just because of bureaucracy and process.
Right, so if that's the specific question, I feel like we will fulfill our obligation to have this ordinance adopted so we can obtain housing element certification, even if that occurs prior to Coastal Commission certification of the ordinance, if that's the more specific question.
It is, yeah, because I wasn't sure if we need to find a zoning district that all zones are outside of the coastal zone.
I have no reason to believe that's
Okay.
that's a factor at this time.
Okay. Then one more item, really minor, but I know that we have parking requirements assigned to the C2 zoning. I feel like bike parking requirements would be beneficial for these emergency shelters because it's very possible that someone utilizing the emergency shelter doesn't have a car, they actually have a bike that they will want to lock up. I'm not sure if the C2 zoning already has a requirement for bike parking, but that's something that I would like to see alongside this.
So perhaps Senior Planner Harkusha can just speak briefly on the types of automobile parking requirements we can impose, and then I can hopefully address the bicycle parking component.
Yes, thank you, Christian. HCD provides provisions of the objective standards that we can impose on these emergency shelters. They specifically reference that we need to allow specific standards that are similar to the zoning district that we're proposing, the development of emergency shelters. From my understanding of the parking ordinance, the minimum requirement for within a C2 zoning district is one employee and visitor per, or one parking space per employee or visitor, and that's consistent with the standard that HCD recommends for emergency shelters. As for bike parking, I am not familiar with the requirements from HCD. They don't state bike parking specifically in the objective standards, but that could be something we could evaluate. It just does take additional analysis of why we are proposing bike parking, and we need to provide HCD with that consistent analysis.
To clarify my question, does the Pacifica Municipal Code for zoning, for the C2 zoning district, have bike parking requirements?
It does, and the conventional bicycle parking requirement is 10% of required spaces or 2, whichever is greater. So we will flesh that out a little bit more after tonight to confirm with HCD whether we can continue to apply that objective, universally applicable parking standard. I have no reason to believe it's particularly burdensome in a way that would cause an emergency shelter, for example, not to be able to operate. It's a relatively small area. These, by and large, are only going to be required to have 1 or 2, maybe 3 parking spaces. So a single bike rack, in effect, will comply with the bicycle parking requirement, and it won't be a burden on an emergency shelter.
Okay. That is all my questions.
And just one other point. In the performance standards, there is a personal property storage requirement for emergency shelters. So that's potentially another way as well for someone to store a bicycle in the event that we're not allowed to also impose a specific, exterior bicycle parking requirement.
I did see that, and I appreciated the thought associated with that. However, I don't know if a personal storage area would be large enough to fit a bicycle. I mean, it could be, larger vertically instead of horizontally. So, but I'd appreciate if you look into the bike parking, because I think that'd be really beneficial for the users of these shelters.
Thank you. Commissioner Wright, do you have any questions?
I have a couple short, relatively easy ones. I was wondering if our consultants for our housing element if we ran this idea by them prior to putting together the staff report?
So work on the emergency shelter ordinance was not initially in the scope of our consultants' work in terms of timeline or budget for the housing element update. The requirement to prepare this ordinance arose from HCD's first comment letter on our draft housing element. And so in the interest of time and budget, city staff took on the work to prepare the emergency shelter ordinance. We've continued to work in concert with the housing element consultant, of course, very closely, multiple meetings per week, most weeks. And so they're aware of this ongoing effort, but they did not specifically engage in the policy drafting.
And along those lines, I'm sure there were a number of considerations, many of which I've heard. You know, we have state law telling us what we have to do. I assume that there's some equity and distribution issues that you had to consider. Could you enlighten us a little bit on all the pains you made to come to the decision to try to give us the best possible product, and really truly taking into consideration all the different factors, all the different people, all the different neighborhoods? Can you elaborate on that a little bit more for us, please?
Sure, and Senior Planner Harkusha can expand or start if you're ready.
Yes, I can start. So in citing all of the, or considering all the zoning districts when citing for emergency shelters, we did start specifically first considering sites based on the criteria HCD deemed as suitable for specific sites to accommodate emergency shelters. And from there, it kind of unveiled the types of zoning districts that may be applicable. When looking at all the zoning districts, we wanted to ensure that there were areas that had amenities and services that could support someone or an individual utilizing an emergency shelter, but then also at the same time, land area-wise, we didn't want to expand too far. If there was, say, if we picked R1, that would have been multiple or a lot more land area than we would actually need to fulfill HCD's requirement to accommodate an emergency shelter. That was I guess the process is just getting through all the criteria first, and then that's how we decided on the C2 zoning district.
And I'll just add a point or two more. So really thinking about zoning districts that allow residential uses, you have purely residential zoning districts and you have mixed use zoning districts. And so we weren't prepared in our initial recommendation to propose purely residential zoning districts for this purpose, which as a planning assumption limited us to the C1 and the C2 zoning districts for all intents and purposes. The C1 and C2 zoning districts both allow mixed use commercial and residential, so they met that minimum criteria of a residential zoning district, if you will. And so with that in mind, comparing C1 to C2, relatively fewer parcels zoned C2 than C1, but typically larger parcels that might be able to incorporate an emergency shelter without predominating the land use on the site. Similarly, some of our key corridors like the Sharp Park, Palmetto, and Francisco corridors, significant portions of C1 zoned land area, which we felt would not serve the community's best interest if several of those were to convert to emergency shelter purposes, for example. So balancing all of these factors, many of which Senior Planner Harkusha articulated, the C2 came out based on whichever method of analysis we used to get to the end state.
So it's safe to assume that you used the best intent to deal with the mandate that we had to give our community the best possible outcome, and that's what the staff recommendation represents.
In my opinion, yes.
That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Well, I really appreciate all the questions. I thought we had some really good ones. I have some additional ones, but a lot of mine have been asked. I'm going to try to ask these in an order that makes sense, but I may be jumping around a little bit. So I think my first kind of global question is, what's the time clock? I mean, we have to do this as part of the housing element. So what is the optimal timing that this needs to be completed in staff's opinion?
As soon as possible, so that it's not an unknown and we can focus our staff efforts on the core housing element update process. This was not an anticipated workload, as I mentioned, and so we're trying to complete this work as quickly as we can, but it has been very difficult, and it's taken away time that would have otherwise been committed to timely preparing the next draft housing element for adoption. And so we would hope to be done with this as soon as we possibly could be.
And am I correct in understanding that this needs to be done for HCD to accept our housing element?
It needs to be completed in order to obtain HCD certification. So they will continue to review any number of drafts that we submit, but this will continue to be a comment and prevent us from obtaining certification and thus concluding our housing element update process until we adopt the emergency shelter ordinance.
So maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but in the hopes that on the second go-around, HCD certifies our housing element, we would need it for this next resubmittal.
That's right. So to put it in sort of broad timeline, March, April timeframe would be the latest I would hope that this ordinance would be concluded. But that's just a date on a calendar. That's not reflecting the additional time staff would continue to work on this if there was a delay in this process on the emergency shelter ordinance.
If I'm understanding correctly, I think this needs to be done for us to respond to HCD and hope to obtain their certification.
Ideally, we would have this ordinance adopted before we submit the next draft for HCD review. Yes.
Okay.
And I would also like to add, in addition to that, is that staff is planning to bring back the next housing element for adoption. And with that adoption, there will be a number of findings which address the fact that the city has complied with all of HCD's comments.
Got it.
So in order to make that finding, one of the requirements would be that this ordinance is
taken care
adopted
of.
so that we can say to we can include in the findings at the adoption hearing that the ordinance has been adopted.
Okay. So the way I'm personally interpreting this is we have to kind of solve this tonight in one way or another, right? So that's what I'm hearing, and I think it's a realistic goal. With that being said, I wanted to understand I don't know much around emergency shelters. I've seen them in San Francisco. I don't see them very many other places. So who builds these emergency shelters? Is it agencies, or are there private entities that do this? Is there like a financial incentive? Is it nonprofits? Like what's?
Yeah, my working understanding is primarily these are operated by nonprofits, but much like affordable housing construction, they will often take significant amounts of government funding assistance to construct and to operate. And so much like affordable housing, they're difficult to construct, and far fewer than the needs that exist typically are constructed and operated. So I don't think there's a scenario where this ordinance is adopted and a deluge of emergency shelters begin to pop up in Pacifica. It's just not the reality of the economics and sort of the operations of these types of uses.
Okay. Okay, so there is like a financial incentive for people to do this that is not agency-based. So we do have to expect that someone will come in and potentially do this. Do we get, this may be a silly question, but do the emergency shelter beds count towards our RENA in any way, shape, or form?
I am not certain whether they do or not.
Okay.
But I can see if I can find an answer during the meeting. My thought is that they may not, but certainly it is helpful to create additional emergency shelter housing and other housing in connection with your housing element.
Okay.
For other programs as well, not just even your numbers.
Sure.
And just one other factor, again, additional benefits of emergency shelters. Not only are you providing shelter for people in need, but my understanding of current law is that in order for the city or any city to impose more strict ordinances on homelessness or encampments, they need to demonstrate the capacity to have sufficient emergency shelters in their community. And so should that occur at some point, multiple shelters be constructed in Pacifica, it could allow the city council the option then to take more aggressive, RV parking or other types of homelessness-related enforcement actions in a way that it perhaps could not or would have a greater difficulty in doing at this point in time. So it's a balancing act, as with so many policy issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think my concern, and Commissioner Berman kind of like, we've kind of all touched on this a little bit, but I want to make sure that between making this zone change and enacting the new zoning for the phase one with the housing element, that we're not cannibalizing our housing element sites. I think that's really important, right? So, if there's like a footnote to the zoning that sites contemplated on the housing element, like, I don't know if we can exclude some housing element sites from it specifically, but that would feel comfortable to me. Maybe not appropriate, but I'm kind of.
The general state mandate just says you need to designate a zoning district where these are allowed as permitted uses. I think we certainly understand the concern with respect to the housing element. So this may be something that we can check with HCD on, and if we're able to do so, we can do so in the draft that moves forward to the council, and if it turns out that we cannot, then we will not.
Well, let me then poll the commissioners and see if that is something that feels comfortable to other people. If HCD allows for it, do we want to accept housing element sites that we've worked to count towards ARENA from Commissioner Godwin?
Well, given that the state has said historically only 1/6 of the housing in the lower income area that was in previous plans was ever constructed, I think double counting sites and hoping to get something, either a low income housing unit or an emergency shelter built, will probably still result in a shortage of both emergency shelters and low income housing. I think, I hear your concern, but I don't think it's very
big enough.
Practical to worry about it. Let's put them all in my opinion, both in the housing element and the emergency shelter ordinance.
I'm certainly in favor of having more control whenever we can, but I know it's a delicate situation, and it's probably more beneficial for us to get our housing element approved as quickly as possible. So I think I would kind of lean on what staff's opinion is, especially because they have a relationship with HCD's reviewers, and so I'll kind of defer to them, is my thought.
Right, and I'll just offer in my professional opinion, if a site is listed in the housing element as a housing site and also could allow emergency shelter construction and operation, I'm not aware of any profit potential from construction and operation of an emergency shelter in its own right. And so if you were to think about the rational property owner in Pacifica, they would likely not go towards developing an emergency shelter if they could also build multifamily or mixed-use housing,
Okay.
And derive a significantly greater profit or a profit at all as compared perhaps to an emergency shelter.
Okay, so then I'll defer to what everybody else is saying. It sounds like, Commissioner Wright, do you have something to add?
I just wanted to see if staff perhaps could contemplate any further restrictions of this big pie that would fit with what your needs and constraints are, to speak more towards the chair's concerns.
Well, I think one area where there's probably some discretion for the commission is with respect to the structure of our current zoning ordinance, which to me is a little unusual, but it's the zoning ordinance we have, which is that for whatever reason in years past, multiple other zoning districts, in this case the office, professional, and commercial recreation CR zoning districts, were amended to inherit the C2 permissible uses. I think it would be very reasonable and maybe help the community understand that, beach areas or certain open space areas that historically have had CR zoning would not become emergency shelters. And so creating carve-outs in those zoning districts to say, sure, the allowable uses are those in the C2 district, except emergency shelters. I think that's one area where there's some discretion to maybe shrink the sites, make the map look a little more sensible, and probably tell a truer story of where these are likely to go. The analysis that we've prepared has only assumed C2 sites and a subset of those, right, with more conservative assumptions. So we could easily exclude all of the O and the CR sites without running afoul of our obligations. And so I think that's one area the commission could make a nice impact on this ordinance.
I personally would absolutely agree with doing that. I see a lot of nodded heads. All
Okay.
unanimous head nods. Okay. So there's no discretion if we do this, right? They're allowed by right, but would they still be required to go through CEQA? So if like a site has a wetland on it, I'm assuming,
The law requires these to be approved without any discretionary action. And so they would be ministerial projects for purposes of CEQA. That doesn't mean that an owner would get out of their obligations under other state or federal laws for resource permitting, for example, for wetlands. But these projects would not be subject to CEQA at the local level.
So Director Murdoch, since you would be the person approving these, would we be able to ask for additional studies like biological research? I mean, a lot of these are in the coastal zone.
So in the coastal zone, my sense is they would continue to require coastal development permits. I'm not aware of an exclusion from that. I don't know if Assistant City Attorney Murphy has a thought on that. Many, if not most, of these state laws require that harmonization. Say, okay, well, we'll go as far as we can, but we're not going to cross the threshold of saying no coastal development permit. With respect to other sites, though, just like any other R1 zone site where someone wants to build a single-family residence, they would be subject to a building permit review only, and we wouldn't be able to ask for biological studies and so forth. So you should think of it in that narrow review category. And then to clarify, yes, there's a provision for the planning director to review and approve. That's the operations plan to demonstrate the specific operational compliance criteria for the emergency shelter. I would not be specifically approving, every building permit. That responsibility is delegated to the planners on the team and other departments to do their respective reviews on each of the projects.
So someone could build an emergency shelter if we do this in C2 with no CEQA and no conditions of approval.
Correct. They would have to demonstrate the operational criteria compliance with their plans submitted for review.
Feels so weird.
So just one clarification. So these would be exempt from CEQA. So if there were, extreme unusual circumstances where there would be, a biological condition or a clear issue, that may be something that we could look at. But again, we couldn't request studies. We couldn't request the typical review process. But typically, the exemptions under CEQA are unless there's, public health or safety issues that you could be able to look at.
What general plan designation is C2 under?
They vary. Most often, it's the commercial land use designation under the prior general plan, and it's a variety of commercial land use designations under the 2040 general plan.
Okay, but because C2 allows residential, it complies with the state law.
And one other thing I'll note that that I was able to look, and the shelter beds would not count towards being.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wishful thinking. Okay, I have one more question, and Ms. Rakush, I'm going to ask that you bring, I didn't quite understand this, but could you put up the sites that are counted in the 1.85 acres? It's 10, 15, and 13 make up
Yes, that's correct.
1.85? Okay. I mean, so that covers all of my questions. I fully am on board with the fact that I feel like we need to figure this out tonight. The sensitive resources component of this is very odd to me. I don't know. Yeah, Commissioner, right?
One more quick question. Is it possible to build into this language that would cap it at a certain number? Or can they just keep building this stuff till we're completely out of our zoning district?
I'm not aware of a way to put a maximum number of emergency shelters in the ordinance. We do have maximum occupants or bed counts. 20, up to 20 is a permitted use, and 21 to 30 would be a conditional use. And in the instance of a conditional use for a larger shelter type, they would be subject to CEQA as a discretionary action. So I guess to qualify my earlier answer, that's for the permitted use of up to 20 beds or occupants. May not be subject to further environmental review. We can impose a buffer under the law of up to 300 feet between emergency shelters. We did not put that together because of the complications of analyzing the potential impacts for a city of our smaller size and compact land use pattern. There's a high potential that that could render a number of sites ineligible if you were to start applying buffers in a variety of hypotheticals, and that would run afoul of our minimum land area obligation. And so it's not something the staff's recommending right now, but if the commission wants to venture into that territory, you can impose a buffer of anywhere from 1 to 300 feet between emergency shelters, which may effectively limit their number, but not expressly limit them.
So, Commissioner Wright, did you have more questions about that?
Not at this time.
I mean, so I guess, and maybe this is just not understanding our building code, and that's totally a very large potentiality in this question, but like, I get Site 13, and I'm removing the asphalt, and I'm grading, and I find a paleontological resource. What do I mean, there's no MMRP that says I have to stop, there's no condition of approval that says I have to stop. What if there's a tribal site? I mean, this.
Like in that hypothetical of a paleontological resource, state law already provides the obligations for a party that encounters such a resource. Typically what you're seeing in a CEQA document is restating compliance with that so that it's front and center, it's clear, and the analysis can conclude that, yes, we've identified a measure that would mitigate that to a less than significant level. As I mentioned earlier, just like with wetlands or, endangered species, the obligations to comply with state and federal law don't go away. There's just not a formal process in the first instance at the local level to highlight the obligation to comply.
So then I think if that's the case, and I mean, I would really want your guys' opinion, but I think if that's the case, we need to somehow restate that in the zoning code. Just like extraneously refer back to those state laws to make sure that it's absolutely clear, because there's not going to be a condition of approval. There's not going to be you reviewing it and making sure. I mean, there are a lot of builders that don't know the laws, right? Especially small ones. And if these sites are less than an acre, that's who you're getting, right? I would hope that they would, but there's no guarantee. So I don't know how to be respectful without somehow making sure people know they have to be respectful.
Perhaps one way to do that would be through the written compliance plan. So the ordinance currently has a performance standard that an operator of an emergency shelter shall have a written management plan, and in addition, the planning director has to review a compliance plan that accompanies, that shows how the facility meets the requirements of the article. So, perhaps we can add in there that the compliance plan shall also, show compliance with all state and federal laws, including, environmental laws.
And I think that's a really good idea, Deputy Attorney Murphy. And I think specifically stating examples of those laws. So, for example, the ones that maybe we've talked about: biological resources, archaeological, paleontological resources, tribal resources. Because I don't think we'll know, right? I think we need to state those. Am I alone on this, or do people agree?
I agree. Regarding the management plan, though, I'm curious when that would occur in the building permit process? Sorry.
I can help answer that question for the
Okay.
management plan. That would be a requirement as part of the first application. So if an applicant is proposing an emergency shelter, they would first need to submit an application with their project description, plans, proposal to be reviewed and approved by the planning director. And then thereafter, they would submit for any potential building permits to develop the shelter.
Okay, because I think we'd want to make sure that the management plan, a developer wouldn't try to defer it, because a lot of these items would need to be figured out in the design process. So, I don't know if that could be worked in also, like there's no opportunity for deferment.
On this general topic, I think it's easy to drill down to the ultra-specific and worst-case scenario, but let me zoom out a little bit and just provide some additional context. So, sure, it may feel unusual that these could come in with a building permit only, but by and large, the projects that the Planning Commission has seen in C2 districts, for example, whether purely commercial or mixed-use, commercial and residential, a very high percentage of those are exempt from CEQA, and we're not analyzing or requiring them to demonstrate compliance with paleontological, inadvertent discovery or specific other state and federal laws in those instances. They're categorically exempt because they're very small projects and they've been determined not to have a significant effect on the environment categorically. And so these projects, you can imagine a shelter for up to 20 persons or beds is not going to be a major project that's going to implicate significant environmental resource impacts. Could human remains be encountered? Sure. But we're not doing that to other types of projects that in many cases will be larger and arguably more impactful than an emergency shelter that might be constructed.
I appreciate that, and really, for me personally, my biggest concern would be related to wetland designation or something that would actually make the development unsafe itself. Is it in a flood zone, but the FEMA flood mitigations aren't going to be addressed? I mean, that's hazardous to even the smallest project.
But that review is performed at the building permit stage, even if there's not a discretionary permit process. Now, if the FEMA maps are incomplete or erroneous, I don't have a safeguard for you in that circumstance, but most of the CEQA review is going to rely on those data sources anyways, so you end up at the same place. The wetlands, again, I think most people recognize that developing in a wetlands area is going to require agency permits. When there's a discretionary process, the city ensures there's a condition of approval, but we're not directly involved in that process anyways. The property owner or developer is undertaking that permitting process. So again, these are very small types of developments that are contemplated. In the largest project that we're talking about, it's a 30-bed emergency shelter. It's not going to be a major development that we're talking about under this ordinance.
Sure, and not to kind of go back in a circle, but I mean, we're talking about kind of a builder's remedy, and a developer could come in and try, I don't know.
But builder's remedy is subject to CEQA. I mean, builder's remedy doesn't,
Right, and
under
this wouldn't be, I don't know.
I mean, when I hear that there are other bigger projects that are already operating without CEQA, my response is maybe we need to add more to those code sections too, so that people know to do this, because a wetland doesn't look like a wetland 100% of the year, right? A seasonal wetland looks like a depression. It may not have any plants in it, but maybe a very important wetland for a red-legged frog or whatever, all these sensitive things, all these esches, all these things that we have. And so, my thought with this is not let's require, we're not going to do that, but I don't think it would be harmful to put some sort of requirement on the management plan that just says, be aware that these state laws exist and you must follow them, right?
I mean, a disclosure like that seems perfectly reasonable to me. Requiring an applicant to analyze and demonstrate compliance seems very different to me. And so I'm not sure, I think I was understanding more of the latter earlier than the former. We can have a disclosure of some commonplace state and federal resource protection laws that we can, perhaps require them to attest to that they'll comply with them. A broader sort of policy concern here is not making this ordinance look like it's targeting or making greater burdens for emergency shelters as compared to other comparable development, and to begin to impose more requirements to study or to analyze or comply would begin to tilt the balance away from a sort of even-handed treatment of emergency shelters. I think what I'm hearing really is we've exposed improvements in the overall development process and framework and zoning that the commission might want to consider very seriously when we come through with a broader zoning effort as part of the phase 2, for example, that's contemplated in the housing element. By all means, that would be a very good time to think about the whole range of development, and if additional, baseline standards and requirements can be put in place for all development, to do it on the back of the emergency shelter ordinance would not be my recommendation.
Followed by Commissioner Wright.
I had one other unrelated question. Can multiple emergency shelters be built on one parcel under this ordinance?
I didn't hear the question. Commissioner Godwin, Brianne Herkusha, Senior Planner. No, only one facility can be built on one parcel. So up to a maximum of 20 people in one facility.
Regardless
As a permitted
of the parcel
use.
size?
Correct.
I'm sorry, correct.
Okay.
Another very general question. In practice, it seems with the additional burden of coastal commission and a large portion of our city being in coastal commission zone, are we not disincentivizing shelters from potentially being built there and therefore putting an unfair burden on the rest of town? And what are we doing to protect against that? How did you factor that into your considerations in putting forth your recommendation?
Well, I don't know that there's anything we can do to undo the process that's involved in obtaining certification of a local coastal program amendment to implement these zoning provisions. And so inevitably, there's going to be a period of time where it will be easier to construct one of these emergency shelters outside of the coastal zone than it will be inside the coastal zone. And that's just the reality, and I don't know that there's any way to prevent that from occurring.
Anyone else?
Do you feel like staff has a good enough idea of what it is that we're looking for, that they can put together some proposed language for a motion? Or do you feel like we need to chew on this some more?
I feel like we're really close, but I disagree with the idea of kicking the can down the road on the.
Could you repeat that?
I haven't quite finished. Sorry, I'll speak more into the microphone. I feel like we're really close, and I think staff did a good job identifying the zoning that does provide the least obtrusive space. I don't feel like the sites are concentrated in one location when I look at the big map, and the vacant area is so small that I don't think it's particularly likely that one neighborhood gets a emergency shelter. But I do think that we're cleaning up the C2 zoning district, and I think that this should be something that applies not to emergency shelters. This being hey, you have to comply with state law, should be applied to all of C2. And then later, yes, I agree that we should try to make sure that all of the by right stuff is thoughtful and sensitive, because Pacifica is a city that cares about this stuff, and I don't think it's in our interest or in the resources' interest to be overlooked when state law already requires that it does. So having clarifying language shouldn't make it more obtrusive, right? As we're saying, it's already part of state law. We're making it easier because we're making it more apparent and less likely for builders to violate a state law. So I would be very much in favor of doing this with the clarification that Director Murdoch made about making sure that this is only applicable to direct C2 and not any other district that refers to C2, like the CR. And then also creating a clarifying statement for all of C2 that by right development still needs to comply with state law. And that one, I don't think we should just limit to C2, but should also refer to all the districts that refer to C2.
What about adding something in the performance standards section?
What page are you on?
I'm on packet page 18.
Under 5304? Yeah.
Yes, 5304. Can we add a letter there?
Well, I think one option is to consider expanding paragraph H, compliance. It's talking about compliance with applicable
Yeah.
state and local
Yeah.
uniform housing and building code requirements. We could add further language about additionally, construction and operation shall
Yeah.
comply with state and federal resource regulations, including but not limited to, and then articulate the few that were mentioned about human remains, wetlands.
Yeah, I think
Major
that's a
species.
great place to put it. I think that's a really good idea.
I think that's an
Commissioner Bergman.
elegant
And
insertion.
And my request, Director Murdoch, is when we do this, we don't just say including, 962, 968, like don't just give numbers, but give numbers and what it relates to.
Like, for instance?
For instance, number blah, 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 paleontological resource, number blah, 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 biological resource, and, those kinds of things. Do we want, maybe I should ask staff, does planning want the authority to be the reviewer of the compliance plan?
That's in fact how this is structured. So the planning director reviews the compliance plan prior to.
Oh, I didn't see that in here. I must have missed it. Okay.
And then the compliance plan is subject to appeal as well.
Appeal by,
The planning director's decision could be appealed.
got it. I
So-
see.
So for example, if an applicant didn't agree with any determinations on the plan, they could appeal it to the planning commission, or a member of the community could as well.
Okay. Does anyone else have thoughts or concerns? Okay.
I'm ready to make a motion once we get to there.
Commissioner Berman.
All right, so before I make the motion, some items that we talked about, Director Murdoch is going to look into bike parking. And then the management plan requirement, I think it is still helpful to reiterate the need for compliance with state laws. I think that's still helpful. But then most importantly, modifying Section 9, 4.5304H, compliance, as we just discussed. So those are the four things, the four modifications. Okay.
And Chair, any commissioner that's considering a motion, we'd ask that they also consider some of the further revisions to the recommended action that we read earlier. So you could sort of take these in sequence and then, and additionally, the amendments discussed tonight during deliberations, which include, the CR and the O district exclusions, and then modifying paragraph H to require a statement about compliance with state and federal law, including but not limited to resource protections and so forth.
Right. And first, does anyone have any objection to some of the modifications shown on the screen? I'm fine with them.
I'm pretty diehard on 180 days. I'm just kidding. I think we're
Okay,
probably all
think we're
fine
good.
looking around.
think that's fine.
Okay. I guess I'll try at this. I move that the Planning Commission finds the proposed ordinance is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, adopts the resolution included as Attachment A to the staff report to recommend approval of the proposed ordinance to the City Council, and incorporate all maps and testimony into the record by reference, and to Attachment A, make the modifications shown, or the modifications presented by staff tonight, items 1 through 5, as well as the items that we just discussed involving removing CR and O districts and requirements for the management plan for developments during the building permit process, as well as modification to item H in section 9, 4.5304.
The bike parking too?
And then additions of bike parking under the discretion of the planning director.
Is there a second for the motion?
I'll second.
Let's please vote.
And that motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, staff, for making sure that this happened. I know this was not a, as you mentioned, not a projected thing, and we appreciate the making sure that everything is happening.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, let me just get back up to the agenda. I think we're on commission communications. Any commission communications? No? Commissioner Berman.
I just wanted to thank my fellow commissioners, city council, and staff just for all the support that I had while I was out for 2 months. And I'm so excited to be back, and I really appreciate everyone's thoughts and kindness.
We're so excited to have you back, and congratulations. I just wanted to say it's been really difficult to watch the news or read the news in the last month or so. And I just want to encourage people to be kind to each other. It's a really hard time, and so that is what I have to say. Moving on to staff communications.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening again, Planning Director Christian Murdoch. My only update tonight, we published this evening a City Council agenda packet for November 13th. It's a study session for the City Council on the Local Coastal Land Use Plan, or LCLUP update. For those that have been following along, it's a multi-year process the city's been undertaking to update what's essentially the companion of the general plan, but focused on the coastal zone. And so City Council approved that document in February of 2020, and fast forward multiple years later, we're approaching a Coastal Commission certification hearing. And so as part of the ramp up for that process, there's a 3-meeting community engagement process starting on November 13th with the study session where the staff will walk through the suggested modifications from the Coastal Commission that their staff has proposed to be a part of the local coastal land use plan approval. We as staff think that the City Council might be interested in considering requests for alternative modifications to those presented by the Coastal Commission staff. So we'll walk through and educate the community and the council on November 13th of the 125 or so suggested modifications that were already proposed, and then make preparations for a second community meeting in early December, followed by a comprehensive consideration item by the City Council in late January to hopefully consider a comment letter. So this process is gearing back up. It's very exciting, but it's also a lot of work ahead for all of us, the community, staff, and decision makers. So November 13th, the City Council agenda posted this evening, and anyone can contact me or Senior Planner Stephanie Cervantes if they have questions about this or have comments to submit. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, does anyone want to make a motion for adjournment? We're going to stay here forever.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, please vote.
That motion passes unanimously.
We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.